So this bicarbonate buffer system, so it's all the bicarbonate in our body is derived from carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide is produced as a result of metabolism, and in the presence of water and an enzyme called carbonic anhydrase. That's what this little Ca is. It's an enzyme called carbonic anhydrase. It's found inside all the cells of our body. So carbon dioxide, when it's produced, diffuses into cells, interacts with the water and carbonic anhydrase of those cells, and forms carbonic acid, H2CO3. That acid can ionize into bicarbonate and free hydrogen ions. And then all of these reactions are reversible, notice. So bicarbonate can combine with hydrogen ion to form carbonic acid. Okay? So this can go back and forth. And then also carbonic acid can reform carbon dioxide. Okay? Again, in the presence of carbonic anhydrase. So the direction of this process really depends on this simple sort of mass action, that what we call mass action, which means that depending on how much of the products we have on at any point in this process will tell you what direction the process will go in. So that means that, for example, if we go from starting from carbon dioxide and moving to the right, if we have more carbon dioxide, okay, if we're in a point where carbon dioxide levels are high, which is what we see in things like venous blood, carbon dioxide levels rising will promote the formation of carbonic acid and promote the formation of bicarbonate and hydrogen ions. Okay. Similarly, if the solution, right, if in the solution we remove hydrogen ions, okay, let's say we added a base and they absorb lots of hydrogen ions, carbonic acid will ionize to a greater extent and donate hydrogen ions to the solution. Okay? That's the buffering effect. And similarly, if the hydrogen ion concentration rises because we introduce some acid to the solution, if the concentration of hydrogen ions rise, this will promote the absorption of hydrogen ions by HCO3 and the formation of carbonic acid, okay, which essentially removes hydrogen ions from the solution. Okay, so whether we have the promotion of the ionization or the promotion of the reverse reaction really depends on how much of each side, right, of the products of each side that we have. Okay. Now, this buffer system, there's certainly a limit to how well it can buffer the pH if you have a rise in acid or a rise in base of the fluid. So the lungs and the kidneys help this buffer system compensate for changes in the pH of body fluids. So in terms of how the lungs contribute to this, the lungs will control respiratory rate and the depth of respirations, which will change how much CO2 is eliminated by the body. So when respiratory rate goes up, when people hyperventilate and they exhale more frequently, more deeply, they blow off CO2. Therefore, their PCO2 goes down, and the CO2 in their body available to produce carbonic acid goes down. Okay? So, generally speaking, CO2 changes in the body, whether CO2 goes up or down, will most directly relate to an increase or decrease in acidity of the body. So the respiratory system can either increase the removal of CO2, okay, or decrease the removal of CO2 based on the respiratory rate and depth. Okay. And this is a very fast response. You can change your breathing very quickly and change CO2 levels and overall pH within minutes to hours. It's a very fast response. The kidneys regulate the other side of this reaction. The kidneys regulate or can contribute to the regulation of bicarbonate and hydrogen ions, okay, by controlling how much how much bicarbonate we conserve, okay, we hold on to, versus excrete through urine, and how much hydrogen ion we are going to excrete through urine. So the kidneys can either increase or decrease the amount of bicarbonate or hydrogen ions that it's removing from the body through urine. Now, as you can imagine, this is a much slower effect. It's a very strong effect, but it's a much slower effect, and it takes somewhere on the order of hours to days. Okay? So when you have a disturbance in body pH, it can be compensated for either by the respiratory system or the kidneys, depending on the situation. Okay? So, when the body fluids, mainly measured by arterial blood, so when arterial blood pH becomes more acidic, we describe that as a state of acidosis. And when our arterial blood becomes more alkaline, we call that an alkalosis. Okay. Now, an acidosis and an alkalosis is defined as being respiratory versus metabolic. Okay. And what that means is the cause, okay, of the acidosis or the alkalosis is either described as being a respiratory cause, so a respiratory acidosis, respiratory alkalosis, or having a metabolic cause, so a metabolic acidosis or a metabolic alkalosis. Okay? A respiratory pH imbalance is caused by the respiratory system, and we'll talk about some of the causes. Actually, how the respiratory system can cause this. Anything that is not caused by the respiratory system, okay, anything other than a respiratory cause, we call that a metabolic cause. Excuse me. Which means that it could be caused by metabolism of energy substrates or metabolism of food producing too much metabolic acid. It can be caused by a malfunctioning renal system that's holding on to too much acid. It can be caused by the consumption of too much acid, okay, or the consumption of too much base. All that entire spectrum of causes that are basically non-respiratory, we label them metabolic. Okay? So let's look at some of these things that can lead to these different pH imbalances. The causes of a respiratory acidosis. Respiratory acidosis is going to happen when there's some malfunction in the respiratory system that causes an accumulation of CO2 and carbonic acid. Okay, so that can be hypoventilation, so you're not breathing fast enough and you're not blowing off that CO2, or you have poor gas exchange, so CO2 isn't able to leave the blood into the lungs. So hypoventilation or poor gas exchange causes an accumulation of CO2 which leads to an overproduction of carbonic acid and a state of respiratory acidosis. Okay. Causes of respiratory alkalosis is the exact opposite. So hyperventilation, breathing too rapidly, depletes CO2. Okay, it reduces the CO2 in our blood because we're blowing it off, and it reduces the amount of carbonic acid. And as a result, we're left with blood that's too alkalotic. So very simple, the causes of respiratory acidosis and alkalosis are really all about CO2. Okay. Causes of metabolic acidosis, metabolic alkalosis, a little more complex because it literally is all other causes. So they include, metabolic acidosis include an increase in non-carbonic acids. So the overproduction of keto acids, we see that when people are breaking down fat as a source of energy exclusively. Okay? So you produce keto acids as a result of that, and if it gets too high, it causes acidosis. Uremia, which is a state of renal failure, basically, where things like uric acid are not getting removed from the bloodstream and removed in the form of urine from the body. And so the level of acids like that rise and can cause acidosis. We can also have excess ingestion of acidic chemicals. Another cause of metabolic acidosis is bicarbonate loss. So anything that causes us to inappropriately lose bicarbonate, like diarrhea, okay, so chronic severe diarrhea. Renal failure, so this is an interesting thing. Renal failure can be a cause, can cause acidosis in a couple of different ways, either by accumulation of acid or increased loss of bicarbonate. And then one specific example of acidosis by a renal cause is called proximal tubule acidosis, and this is where again we lose too much bicarbonate and we retain too much acid. Okay. So as you can notice, the renal impairment is a major mechanism for metabolic acidosis. Metabolic alkalosis can be caused by an excess loss of non-carbonic acids. So prolonged vomiting, you lose a lot of hydrochloric acid, which is going to change the body's pH. Excessive GI suctioning, right? Gastrointestinal suctioning, again, removes acid that's in the GI system. Hyperaldosteronemia, right, promotes the loss of acid. Some diuretic therapies can also do this. Okay. Or another cause of metabolic alkalosis can be an excess of bicarbonate intake. So you're consuming something that has too much bicarbonate in it, and that causes the arterial blood to become more alkalotic. So respiratory acidosis, respiratory alkalosis versus metabolic acidosis, metabolic alkalosis. This is describing the cause of the acid-base imbalance. Okay? Now, a respiratory acid-base imbalance is not, as you can imagine, a respiratory acid-base imbalance is not going to be compensated for by the respiratory system. If the respiratory system is the cause of the acid-base imbalance, then it is not available to participate in compensation. In that case, the renal system must compensate. So if the lungs are causing the imbalance, then it's the renal system is the only system left to help compensate. And then the reverse is also true. If the renal system is the cause of the acidosis or alkalosis, okay, then it's not available for compensation. The respiratory system is the system that is left to compensate. Okay. So, when you are trying to decide whether or not someone is in an acid-base imbalance and what kind of imbalance it is, and whether or not there's been any compensation, okay, all of that information can be determined based on three blood values. Okay. It's going to be determined by the pH of the blood, the PCO2 measurement of the blood, and the bicarbonate concentration in the blood. These three pieces of information are going to be able to tell you whether or not a person is in acidosis or alkalosis, what kind of imbalance it is, and whether or not there is compensation. Excuse me. So, in this graph, what we have is a breakdown of all the different types of imbalances and what these three factors are going to look like at the start of the imbalance and what they would look like when the compensation kicks in. So, a metabolic acidosis. Metabolic acidosis, the pH is going to be low because it's an acidosis. So it's going to be lower than our normal range. The PCO2 is going to be normal. Okay? PCO2 is a function of the respiratory system. Since the respiratory system is not malfunctioning in a metabolic acidosis, then the CO2 levels are going to be normal. Now, whenever we have a metabolic problem, it's going to manifest as an initial abnormality with HCO3. Okay? So whenever we have a metabolic acidosis or metabolic alkalosis, it's really being caused by this change in bicarbonate.